I decided to read Marx years ago as if I'd never heard of him. Mm-hmm. Most people, if they read Hegel, they don't think beforehand that they know Hegel. Or if they do, they're very foolish. So they read Hegel to try to see what he is arguing. My experience has been that many people read Kapital as if they already know what Marx is saying, and they just want to see how he says it. So how does he, in a sense, justify positions that he had already expressed, for example, in the Communist Manifesto? And I think that's a mistake. It's a serious mistake, and for me personally, the reception of the Grundrisse was extremely important in making clear to me that whereas I think in much orthodox Marxism, Marx is understood as a critical political economist, that he wrote a critique of political economy. And I think there's a fundamental difference between being a critical political economist and writing a critique of political economy. The critique of political economy, its central theme is that the commodity form, and therefore value, is historically specific. So it's not as if the problem with Adam Smith was that he didn't consistently understand that it's only workers who create the surplus. Sometimes he says that, sometimes he has various factors of production. But that Smith didn't understand that value is historically specific to capitalism. The dialectic of value and use value has too often been interpreted, even by people like Lukács, and to some degree I would say by Adorno, as they understand the commodity form really as the domination of value over use value. So that in a sense, use value then just has to emerge from under the shell of value. And I think that the dialectic that Marx develops in Kapital is much more complicated than that. There is a dialectic of value and use value. And it gives rise to an increasing contradiction between what is and what could be. So that the standpoint of the critique is what could be, not the use value that is subsumed by value. People who focus only on the market and private property essentially are not focusing on value. Or what they think is that value is a category of the market. When Marx speaks of the historical specificity of value, he talks about the historical specificity of a form of wealth that is created only by the expenditure of human labor time. The question of the market is a question that he deals with in Volume 2, which has to do with how surplus value is mediated and circulated. That in Marx's time, the two were intimately tied together is clear. But the first volume of Kapital, that depends on the theory of value pointing beyond itself, doesn't depend on the mode of distribution. It depends on the temporal measure of wealth. And once you have that in place, then I think it becomes understandable why the Soviet Union was not and could never have been socialist. And it seems to me that the debate between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks at the beginning of the 20th century was unfortunate in that it was all placed in terms of class. So the Mensheviks didn't say that you need capitalism to have socialism, but that you need bourgeois domination before you could have proletarian domination. Lenin then argued that the Russian bourgeoisie were incapable. And at first, it seemed as if he thought that the proletariat would have to accomplish what the bourgeoisie already accomplished. And then that sort of got lost in the shuffle. So that it's a serious mistake to view the Soviet Union as the only problems were political, bureaucratization, Stalin, but that the basis was socialist. The basis was the same as in the West, with the difference that primitive accumulation had to be effected. So the planning was the planning of primitive accumulation. That's not a recipe for socialism. Now, if anything, one could argue that the experience of the Soviet Union showed that state control of value production is not an efficient way of distributing value. What I'm trying to suggest is that the ontologization of labor is a fetish. That is, it is the form in which a historically specific function of labor in capitalism appears to analysis as the expenditure of human energy. Muskel, nerve, Hirn, und so weiter. Yeah, but it can't be that. It can't be that. Human physiology remains transhistorical. Value doesn't. And I think one of the reasons why the book, Capital, is easy to misunderstand is that whereas in the Grundrisse, because he's writing notes to himself, he will say value is historically specific. In Capital, it has to be, everything has to be immanent. So it appears transhistorical. It only emerges that it's not transhistorical once he introduces machinery and large-scale industry. When Marx introduces, he has three major chapters on Kooperation, Manufaktur, große Industrie. When he introduces cooperation, he talks about how the workers working together, just by virtue of working together, they have a productive force which is greater than the sum of their parts. And that productive force belongs to the capitalist. Good. If that would be as far as Marx got, then the negation of that would be you do away with the capitalist, and the productive force created by the workers belongs to them. It's theirs, collectively. In manufacture, it's already a little tricky. It's a little tricky because the nature of the labor itself is terrible. It's terrible. Each person, you know, Adam Smith has this famous example of the pin factory where somebody pulls a piece of wire 48,000 times a day. If you do away with the capitalist, what is left? Somebody pulling 48,000 times a day, except now he'll get the pins. That for Marx is not emancipation. But even more significantly, once he moves to what he calls große Industrie, which is really about science, what he says is that the productive capacity of Capital no longer can be reduced to that of the immediate workers. So the immediate workers are there as necessary for Capital, but no longer, in a sense, for the, he begins using words like Gattungsvermögen, which has extended beyond what the workers produce. So that in a sense, what he in his early writings, and maybe ontologized, I'm not sure, called Gattungswesen, is something which is created by capital as capital. So capital becomes the constitution of species general capacities that could be used to reorganize labor so that people didn't have to pull wire 48,000 times a day. The fact that they do, for Marx, value theory in part explains that. Value theory explains that no matter how developed science and technology become, that post-industrial theory is wrong, that we won't just have a linear development to a future where work will be meaningful for everybody, because capital always has to reassert value-creating labor. And it seems to me that that's a fundamentally different perspective than classical Marxism. It's a perspective about the abolition of the proletariat, not the realization of the proletariat. I mean, all of the great Mexican muralists, that's all the glorification of proletarian labor. It's wonderful, but it's another era. Once Adam Smith has a transhistorical understanding of value, transhistorical means there's no such thing as overcoming value. Transhistorical notion of structure means there's no such thing as overcoming structure. However, on the other side, the rational core of what Althusser tried to do is that it is a serious mistake to regard capitalism simply as in class struggle terms. It's a very serious mistake. You just don't get very much. And so it becomes a really partial theory of modernity, and one that's becoming less and less viable. Class struggle will not get you the trajectory of capital development. Now, it does seem to me that what Marx did was through value theory, through the theory of the commodity and capital, he explained why it is that capitalism has a historical dynamic. So that the existence of a historical dynamic, A, is a characteristic of capitalism. No other society has that. So it's not that you have this evolutionary movement from Urschleim zu Scheidemann. Yeah. However, if you don't understand the logic of capital, then you are truly helpless. Then you have no idea really what's going on, and it just becomes a Sisyphus, well, we've just got to fight harder. We've just got to fight harder. And I think that one of the serious weaknesses with post-structuralist thought, with the emphasis on contingency, is that precisely because they try to ground contingency transhistorically, they have no way of explaining capital. None. So they think they're guaranteeing freedom by inscribing it metaphysically in the order of things, and all that does is weaken people in terms of being able to at least think about what are we up against, and we're up against a lot. And it's not that I have answers, but I think that the traditional Marxism and the post-structuralist reaction against it are both useless for us. They may give easy answers. No, they don't give easy answers. They give pacifiers. You know what pacifiers are? What children suck on? People don't think of themselves historically. Why is it that in the period, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, what some people would call Fordist capitalism, everybody thought in terms of structure, and starting in the 1970s, the left talks about agency and the right talks about rational choice. And the left doesn't see that it's part of the same wave as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism also is all about agency. That's its ideology. And in a sense, both of them are reacting against the forms of the 50s and 60s. Fordist Keynesianism or the command economy in the East. And it's a one-sided reaction. And there's a continuum between the lefties who talk about agency and the right wing in my economics department at the University of Chicago, the Chicago boys. They also love talking about agency. Is that emancipatory? I'm not sure. We're confronted with a problem that already early on the Frankfurt School saw and couldn't solve, which is, with Pollock's thesis of state capitalism, the idea was that the market and private property are abolished, and the result isn't good, which means that this is an inadequate theory as a theory of liberation. Then they, I think, turned themselves inside out trying to come up with one. And that's the reason, because they reached a dead end, that Habermas took the road that he did. But he took the road that he did because they ran into a dead end, and I think he's right that they ran into a dead end. There's no just going back to Adorno and that's the answer. However, since '73, there is no going back. There's no going back to the Keynesian welfare state. It's not just because the bourgeoisie suddenly got more strong than the workers, and if the workers get strong again, we can have Keynesianism again. It's not going to happen. And the Soviet Union collapsed, and it wasn't a model anyway, but certainly its collapse means this is not a model. And as long as people think that they know what socialism is, and it's just a matter of, does the theory tell us, give us Handlungsanweisungen, then it's easy. But under these circumstances, the entire thing is much more up for grabs. And that's one of the reasons why I went back to try and come up with a theory of capital that didn't depend on private property in the market. That's a losing proposition, historically. Either you come up with a critique of capitalism that isn't dependent on the market and private property, or you might as well give up the critique of capitalism and just say, okay, let's criticize modernity. I think it's a very difficult question. I think it's a complicated one. On the one hand, I think that, at least for some people, the attempt to find out the degree to which you can use the capitalist state to make capitalism a little more humane is worthwhile. There are, however, serious restrictions. The main restriction is no capitalist state can exist if valorization doesn't happen. That doesn't mean that everything has to follow one model or another. There can be different models by which you can effect valorization. And I think that political struggle there is important. However, a lot of this political struggle has to become global in ways in which it just has not. Global does not mean running to the third world and glorifying a local resistance group. Or everybody from Frankfurt in the 70s went and built one road in Portugal. This is not global. This is a debased notion of internationalism, which is that we support the nationalism of somebody else. Which is, if there's ever a real theory of nationalism written, people should stop looking at the state and they should start looking at the left. Because the left has been nationalist of somebody else for a long time. And then you might get at understanding. This isn't only an accusation and a criticism, but also it's a problem to understand. Then maybe you could understand the kind of consciousness that goes into nationalism. At least when it was nationalism of, and I've written about this, when it was nationalism of, let's say, the Vietnamese, you could tell yourself that this was in the name of a progressive alternative. The Vietnamese were building socialism. You may not have liked the socialism, but the idea was that the Americans are preventing something that is progressive. And not only are they preventing it, they're preventing it in an extremely brutal fashion. But the idea was fighting against the Americans was fighting for something progressive. With the Iraq War, that's not the case anymore. Es schadet nicht, diese Forderungen zu stellen. Aber die Forderungen werden sehr leicht dann nationalistisch. Und ich meinte es nicht jetzt bezüglich linken Nationalismus, sondern eine Art von Xenophobie. Und man sieht das sehr stark in den USA. Und es ist auch mit ein Grund, warum es ist gerade die Arbeiterklasse, die sehr stark nach rechts gegangen ist. Und das ist nicht einfach ein Mythos, weil ihre Arbeitsplätze sind unter Beschuss durch mehrere Entwicklungen. Nicht nur, weil es gibt so viele illegale Einwanderer, sodass die Illegalität wird einfach auch zu einer Art von Lightning Rod, ein Blitzableiter für vieles. Aber diese vieles auch existiert. Es ist nicht einfach ein Hirngespinst seitens dieser Arbeiter, dass ihre Arbeitsplätze gehen verloren. Es ist nur, dass sie verstehen gar nicht, was die Prozesse sind. Und sie glauben, es ist alles wegen die illegalen Einwanderer. Ich finde, dass ein Teil dieser Möglichkeit, die ich nenne, im Moment hervorruft eine Art von real existierender Barbarei. Das heißt, die Überflüssigkeit von menschlicher Arbeit wird zunehmend, besonders in sogenannter Dritte Welt, zur Überflüssigkeit von Menschen. Die riesigen Städte im Süden, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Mexiko, sind nicht wie, sagen wir, am Anfang des 20. Jahrhunderts. Man hat ein paar Städte, die explosiv gewachsen sind, besonders Berlin und Chicago. Aber sie waren proletarische Städte. Diese neuen Städte sind lumpenproletarisch. Und es gibt keine Möglichkeit, dass sie werden proletarische Städte. Und ich bin mir nicht sicher, was für eine Politik daraus folgt. Und ich finde, dass wir in einer sehr schwierigen Situation sind. Und ein Teil, die traditionelle Linken, die nur auf die traditionelle Arbeiterklasse pochen, historically they're lost. And the people who thought Third World Revolution was going to save everything were lost even when they began, and now it's just become completely clear. I mean, you have to be blind, literally blind. They tried to say, well, because Mubarak was an American ally, as if you didn't have the same terroristic state apparatus under Sadat and Nasser. So I think that we're faced with a serious dilemma. And I don't have answers, but I do try to argue against false paths, paths that I know are going to lead nowhere, such as the two I've just mentioned. You know, which is why those segments of the left become culturally important for the left and really insignificant in terms of the world. And in general, it seems to me that we have to slowly try moving towards internationalism but not of the debased sort, starting with 1917, which was basically Soviet nationalism. And everybody had, you know, the motherland of socialism. But more like what ideally existed, but only ideally, as an idea of internationalism in the Second International with all of their weaknesses. They didn't see themselves as defending one regime against another. Their greatest failure, therefore, was the First World War. And as long as internationalism has a form of anti-imperialism, it won't happen. And most of the forms of internationalism that do exist don't deal with capital enough. There, you know, there's the ecology movement, which, after all, tries to be international. There are things like amnesty, try to be international. You know, and das sind Ansätze that are partial, that you can criticize for a variety of reasons, but I think the tendency has to be to try, and it's different than the celebration of anything down the pike that's anti-American. There were two very different movements. One was the civil rights movement that was predicated on the idea equality, and the other was a movement a lot of people don't realize, and I only found this out recently, and it makes a lot of sense to me. There were more black workers in 1948 than in 1965. Chronic unemployment in the North began in the 50s and throughout the early 60s. And in a sense, the civil rights movement was still predicated on the idea of an expanding economy. That the economy wasn't expanding for workers. At first was evident only for blacks. That's why I called it the canary in the coal mine. After the early 70s, it became for more and more people. Now, the people who actually focus on this and understand this, even if it's in a one-sided way, are people like Crisis and Exit. They understand this. The traditional Marxists are clueless. They're totally clueless. Their notions only make sense if the working class were still growing, or at least weren't shrinking. One person who did realize it was King, and he became decried as an Uncle Tom by black nationalists. So you had the rise of black nationalism as a reaction that didn't understand its own political economic despair. That's how I would analyze it. A theory should explain something. It shouldn't just be, what do I need in order to be able to act? Right? Then you can go to motivational speakers too. How can I make $1 million? How can I make the revolution? I think hegemony theory is really weak. I've always preferred Lukács, as maddening as he is sometimes, and Adorno, because they help explain why in the 20th century people think differently than in the 19th. Hegemony theory is functionalist. All it does, people think it's so wonderful because it shows that alles ist nicht nackte Gewalt. No, good. So it has an opening for an understanding of culture, but it itself is not a culture theory. It doesn't explain why bourgeois culture looks this way, why it looked different in 1789 than it does in 1910. Unless to say, well, they're fearful now of the proletariat. That still doesn't get you very far.
George Bush is the man of peace.
Yeah, well, yes, that's very unfortunate. It was very unfortunate because, of course, I was very sympathetic to the critique on anti-imperialism. But that to run around and your best friends are Bush and Sharon is a mistake. Now, Bush and Sharon did not control the world. That much is true. Princes of peace, they were not. Yang, like many reformist movements, I think it's extremely important to realize that actually capitalism is destroying the globe. It really is. I think there are contradictions, deep contradictions, with any idea of green capitalism. Nevertheless, there's also deep contradictions with social democracy. That is, so as a reformist movement, it can also indicate the limits of capitalism for anything green. If it reaches more people than a pure green movement, that's not so bad. So I don't think that it should be viewed the way any reformist movement is viewed, which is, does it help create a consciousness then that will lead to an awareness of the limits of its own program? Now, I don't know enough about specifically what they mean by green capitalism, but it strikes me as being a reasonable reformist movement that will run up against its limits. The fact that it will, well, I'm repeating myself, doesn't mean that therefore you throw it in the garbage can. All reformist movements run up against limits. The question is what you do once you reach the limits. Okay, that's the short answer.